In this lecture, we're going to begin our exploration of the African American culture in the United States. And how we are going to focus on that is, as in other cases, we're going to use Supreme Court cases as our guidelines. In this section, we'll actually look at three different Supreme Court cases. We'll cover the first today, which is the Dred Scott v. Sanford case, and then in the part two of this lecture next week, we will look at Plessy versus Ferguson and Brown versus the Board of Education. However, before we get there, I need to give you a decent amount of history because we left off last time with the case of Marbury versus Madison, where the Supreme Court became supreme, if you will. This is where they basically gave themselves the power of judicial review, which is the court's ability to declare any act of any government official or any law unconstitutional, and therefore null and void. So we need to look at some history, and what I want you to pay attention to is the building tensions within the country, because we're going from Marbury versus Madison. Jefferson is still president. Remember, Marbury was decided in 1803. The Dred Scott case was not decided until 1857. Yet, we have this building of tension within the United States. It's also a time of exploration and manifest destiny in the United States. Again, remember, manifest destiny is the idea that many Americans held that it was their God-given duty to go from the East Coast to the West Coast. And these lands from the original 13 colonies and then the states that we had in 1803, much of this land was owned still by France, by Mexico, by Spain, and those were the three main areas. Eventually we'll get to Alaska, which was owned by Russia. But pay attention in here. There's going to be a lot of history, but pay close attention to the building tensions between the races and the building tensions over slavery. So we'll start here from Marbury to Dred Scott. So Marbury versus Madison was decided in 1803. Jefferson is still president. Well, what happens is we have the Louisiana Purchase of 1803. And with this, Thomas Jefferson wanted to purchase the port of New Orleans from the French. Why? This port was the major port where the Mississippi River meets the ocean, and goods were often transferred there to smaller ships, from smaller ships to the ocean-going vessels, or ocean-going vessels to the smaller ships, and then the goods would be transferred up the Mississippi River. Well, what happened was Robert Livingston, who was the American ambassador in Paris, on his own proposed that the French actually sell not just the port of Louisiana or the port of New Orleans, but all of Louisiana. Well, Napoleon, the leader of France at the time, actually decided to offer the entire Louisiana territory, which you can see on this map here. You can see what is labeled as the Louisiana Purchase. The reason that Napoleon did this is he's got the Napoleonic Wars, as we call them now, going on, and Napoleon needed the money. So what happens is Livingston and James Monroe actually accept the offer. They had no authority to do this, but they wanted to go ahead and accept it right then because they were afraid Napoleon would withdraw the offer. The agreement was actually signed on April 30th, 1803. The United States paid $15 million to France, and they granted the French exclusive commercial privileges to both France and the residents of Louisiana. Then the residents of Louisiana were then adopted as full citizens of the United States. Jefferson was not even sure he could actually authorize this, but what he did was that he claimed it was under his treaty-making power in the Constitution. Congress didn't balk at this because they also wanted the land and they were quick to agree. So we have the Louisiana Purchase coming into the United States. Well, then next, westward exploration, it continues. 1804, we have the Lewis and Clark expedition, and here they wanted to cross the country clear to the Pacific Ocean. The goal of this was to gather geographical facts and possible trading routes with the Indians. Again, the Napoleonic Wars are happening in Europe, and Americans are warring with Native Americans. The Native Americans were committed to protecting the land from what they saw as the European intruders. In the presidential election of 1808, James Madison won, and he was president from 1808 to 1817. And what began at this time is you start to see a desire for Florida. Why? Because slaves from the southern regions could escape there, and the people in the United States had no authority to go in and get them back. Also, there were also Indian attacks from Florida. They would come from that area, come up to the United States, and then go back down. But most of all, many Americans wanted that access to the Gulf of Mexico. And at this time, Florida was controlled by Spain. Well, in 1810, American settlers actually seized the Spanish fort of Baton Rouge, and the federal government happily annexed it into the Union and then made plans to acquire the rest of Florida. Well, then we have the War of 1812, and this is where America declares war on Britain. Why? They wanted to gain control of the northern lands, meaning Canada and the Great Lake regions, and southern lands, meaning Florida. Andrew Jackson, a wealthy Tennessee planter, gains fame in this conflict, and we'll talk more about Jackson later. By 1813, by 1813, Napoleon was on his way to final defeat, and the British turned to focus on the War of 1812 with the Americans. On August 24th, 1814, the British actually invaded Washington, D.C., and burnt much of it to the ground, including the White House. The British then traveled toward Baltimore, which was guarded by Fort McHenry. The British had to bombard the fort from a distance, and this bombarding continued throughout the night on September 13th. And you can see this from this painting here. This is the bombing of Fort McHenry. Well, an observer on a British ship, he was actually a lawyer from Washington, and he was there to negotiate the return of prisoners. And he noted by the next morning that by dawn's early light, he could still see the flag of the fort still flying. This, of course, was Francis Scott Key, who later wrote the poem The Star-Spangled Banner. Then this poem became the inspiration in 1931, became the official national anthem. And then we have the Battle of New Orleans, January 8th, 1815. Here, Jackson defeated the British, and he actually forced them to retreat. In this battle, there were 700 British dead, 1,400 British wounded, and 500 taken prisoners. On the American side, they suffered only 8 casualties and only 13 were wounded. Interestingly enough, with this battle, the war had actually officially ended weeks before by a peace treaty that had been signed in Europe on Christmas Eve of 1814. But you have to remember of the times, to get information to come across, literally the information would have to be mailed, be sent on a ship to come across. So in the United States, where the War of 1812 was going on, the battle actually continued. So with the end of the War of 1812, we then get what's called the Great Migration. And this is more Americans moving westward. Why? Because in the eastern states, there wasn't enough room anymore. Between 1800 and 1820, the population of the United States almost doubled from 5.3 million to 9.6 million. And there just wasn't enough room in the east, and in the south you had these sprawling plantations that took most of the south up. And you have to remember at this time, most Americans were still farmers. This is also known as the era of good feelings, and what it was a time of prosperity. The expansion of the economy, the growth of white settlements and trade in the West, the creation of new states, these all reflected the rising spirit of nationalism in the years after the War of 1812. James Monroe was elected president in 1816 and was re-elected in 1820. Now at this time, Florida still is not a part of the Union, but the Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams, began to lead a campaign to gain Florida, and Andrew Jackson was in charge of the American troops along the border. And he was ordered to, quote, adopt the necessary measures, unquote, to stop Indian raids from Florida. Basically what this was is it gave Jackson authorization to invade Florida, and that's what he did. He invaded Florida and he seized the Spanish forts that were there. Adams claimed the United States could do this because under international law, they had the right to defend themselves against threats coming across the border. And what this showed, it showed Spain that America could take Florida if they wanted to, and Adams alluded that they just might. So because of this, we get the Adams-Honest Treaty of 1819, where Spain ended up ceding all of Florida to the United States and gave up its claim to the territory north of the 42nd parallel in the Pacific Northwest. What happens is America then gave up its claim to Texas. For a time. We all know how that turns out. Well, now this is where the history is going to start affecting more of the cases that we're going to look at. And this starts with the Missouri Compromise of 1820. Because what happens, we have the country which is already divided between slave states and free states. Many of your northern states were free, many of your southern states wanted or supported slavery. Well, what happens is Missouri applies for statehood in 1819. Slavery was already established there, and you can see in this organization, you see on the map which states and territories were already free. The red states are slave states and territories. And we're going to see what happens with the Missouri Compromise. So Missouri applies for statehood, and Representative James Talmadge Jr. of New York proposed that no more slaves be allowed there, and the ones that were there would eventually be emancipated, meaning they would be freed. Before now, we didn't really see much of this conflict because the states came into the Union almost in pairs. And it seemed that one from the South came in, one from the North came in. And in 1819, there were actually 11 free states and 11 slave states. Well, Missouri would upset that balance. Well, what ends up happening is Maine then applied for statehood as a free state. Well, Speaker of the House Henry Clay of Kentucky claimed that if the northern members blocked Missouri from entering as a slave state, then the southern members would then block Maine from entering as a free state. Well, Maine actually proposed a compromise that put both proposals for statehood into one bill, that Missouri would enter as a slave state and Maine as a free state, with an amendment that the rest of the Louisiana Purchase territory north of the southern boundary of Missouri, which is the 36th parallel, would prohibit slavery. And you can see that within this map here. What territory that with the purple would be closed to slavery because of the Missouri Compromise. You had a lot of people who were against this because you can see this is a major land area that would then be free. However, both sides do agree to this compromise. It passes, and both states then enter the Union. Maine as a free state, Missouri as a slave state, and then any territories above that 36th parallel would then enter into the Union as a free state. So what ends up happening in 1823, we have what's called the Monroe Doctrine. This is where President Monroe declares that, quote, the American continents are henceforth not to be considered subjects for future colonization by European powers, unquote. Basically, the U.S. was telling the other countries, France, Spain, Great Britain, who had been colonizing within the United States, within the Americas, that the U.S. would consider any new foreign challenge an unfriendly act and therefore an act of war. So this was a major move by the United States, this very new country, saying these lands are sovereign, they are no longer up for grabs or for colonization. In 1824, John Quincy Adams is elected president. 1828, Andrew Jackson, who came to fame in the War of 1812, is elected president. And then in 1836, Martin Van Buren is elected president. And then some other things that are also going on at this time. We have the Trail of Tears, which took place between 1830 and 1838. This virtually removed all Indians, and Native Americans were forced to what was called Indian Territory, which is now modern-day Oklahoma. In 1836, Texas declares its independence from Mexico. It was its own sovereign nation, and twice it tried to join the United States, but it was rejected. Why? Look how big Texas is, and it would be under that 36th parallel, so it would come in as a slave state. Many of the northern states were worried about having Texas come in because of this issue. And Texas actually did not become a state until 1845. In 1840, William Henry Harrison was elected president. He was 68 years old at the time. Interesting facts about him, he actually gave the longest inaugural speech. It was over 2 hours long on a cold, wet day. Well, Harrison had been a war hero, but because of his advanced age, people were worried about him being a strong president. So he wanted to show he was still as strong as he had been when he was this war hero. So in the presidential parade, he refused to wear a hat or gloves, and when he gave this inaugural speech outside in the cold and the wet, he actually ended up developing pneumonia, and he died 1 month after taking office in 1841. So he actually has the shortest term as a president, and he was also the first president to die in office. Because of this, John Tyler becomes president. In 1844, James K. Polk is elected president. Then we move on to the Mexican War. In 1846, the United States declared war on Mexico. Why? The Texas-Mexico border had been disputed, and Americans also wanted what's now New Mexico and California. Polk tried to buy the area first, but Mexico refused, and then war was declared. Settlement was eventually made, and America was again expanded, and you can see that in the map here. Now, at this time, an amendment was proposed prohibiting slavery in any territory acquired by Mexico. It passed in the House, but it failed in the Senate. In 1848, Zachary Taylor is elected president. During this time, we have the California Gold Rush, so we see massive amounts of people moving out to California to try to make their riches and stake their claims. Now, Taylor thought that statehood could decide the problem of slavery in the territories, and what he wanted was when the states proposed to join the Union, that they themselves would propose whether they were free or slave. And he said as long as the area was a territory, the federal government was responsible for deciding the slavery question. Again, he thought, no, the state should decide on its own when it petitioned for statehood. So what happens? California adopted a constitution and asked Congress to be admitted as a free state in 1849. However, Congress balked for a variety of reasons. First, the anti-slavery forces wanted to abolish slavery in Washington, D.C. Second, the northern states had passed personal liberty laws which stopped courts and police officers from returning runaway slaves. And third, but most important, you have the white South's fear that the new free states would add to the North's majority. In 1849, there were 15 free states and still 15 slave states. But you had California, New Mexico, Oregon, and Utah all candidates for statehood. So Canada has already applied to come in as a free state, and there is a fear these other states will also. So at this point, the southern states start talking about secession, and every northern state's legislature but one adopted resolutions demanding the prohibition of slavery within the territories. So you can see at this time this rising tensions that had been there for years, but it's almost to the point where it's coming to a head. And this we're going to see in the Compromise of 1850. So what happens in the Compromise of 1850 is, again, Henry Clay, the great compromiser, proposed California come in as a free state. However, the territorial governments and the rest of the lands acquired from Mexico come in without restrictions on slavery, meaning they would come in as slave states. He also proposed the abolition of slave trade, but not slavery itself, in Washington, D.C., and he proposed a new and more effective fugitive slave law. Fugitive slave law is what allowed slave owners, if their slaves escaped into free territory, it gave them the right, the authority to come back to free areas and still get their slaves back as their property. Well, this compromise started over 7 months of fierce debate. On July 9, 1850, one of the biggest obstacles to the compromise was removed. President Taylor suddenly dies from a violent stomach disorder, and Millard Fillmore of New York becomes president. He supported the compromise, where Taylor had been against it. So the new president supports the compromise. What happens? The compromise was passed, and then this seemed to quiet things down for a few years. However, in 1852, Franklin Pierce is elected president, and he often tried to avoid the slavery issue completely, but events would not let him, such as Northern opposition to the Fugitive Slave Act. You would have mobs that would form to prevent enforcement of the law, and then states would pass their own laws barring the deportation of fugitive slaves. Well, then we get the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. What happens is the Transcontinental Railroad was being built, and Democrat Stephen A. Douglas proposed opening a new territory, Nebraska, for development. You can see that on the map here. Douglas knew the South would oppose this because the territory would be free under the Missouri Compromise. So what he did is he added a clause saying the territory would decide on its own the status of slavery. In theory, the region could choose to be a slave state against the earlier compromise. He also then inserted a clause that actually repealed the Missouri Compromise and divided the area into two territories, Nebraska and Kansas, and you can see that on the map here. It was very likely that Kansas would become a slave state. President Pierce supported the bill, and it was passed into law in May 1854. And many scholars claim that no piece of legislation in American history produced so many immediate, sweeping, and ominous political consequences. It literally divided and destroyed the Whig Party, who up until this point had been one of the most powerful political parties, and it actually helped form a new party, the Republican Party. So what we have now from 1855 to 1856 is what's known as Bleeding Kansas. Because of this decision, we see all of this turmoil in the Nebraska and Kansas territories. Well, what happens? White settlers flocked to Kansas, and in 1855, elections were held to form a territorial legislature. There were actually only about 1,500 legal voters in Kansas. But remember, they were able to decide now with the Kansas-Nebraska Act, they were able to decide whether Kansas would come in as free or slave. So in the elections, thousands of Missourians, most of them armed, traveled to Kansas and swelled the vote to over 6,000 people, and slavery becomes legalized within Kansas. Pierce announced those who were in Kansas blocking slavery. He told them that they were traitors, and Pierce backed the pro-slavery legislature. Because of this, fighting broke out. This is when John Brown committed the Potawatomi Massacre, killing 5 pro-slavery settlers, and guerrilla warfare was conducted by both sides. And then each side blamed the other, claiming Bleeding Kansas became a powerful symbol of the sectional controversy that was strongly developing in the United States. So at this time, we have two main arguments or points of view in the slavery debate. In the North, we have what was called the free soil ideology. And this is where most white Northerners came to believe that the existence of slavery was dangerous, but not because of what it did to the slaves, but because of what it threatened to do to the whites. They argued that at the heart of American democracy was the right of all citizens to own property, to control their own labor, and to have access to opportunities for advancement. According to this vision, the South was the antithesis of democracy. It was a closed, static society in which slavery preserved an entrenched aristocracy. So the North at this time also, the North is flourishing. It's becoming more modern. We're seeing the development of cities and more factories. The South had become stagnant. Why? It was rejecting both individualism and progress. In the South, the plantation still ruled. Agriculture still ruled. Why? The idea that cotton was king. They didn't need to advance like the North did. And so you have these two very different ways of life between the North and the South. Now, some Northerners claim the South actually wanted to extend slavery throughout the entire nation and make the entire country like the South. Many Northerners believe the only way to fight this was to fight the spread of slavery and extend the nation's democratic ideals to all sections of the country, meaning no slavery at all. The Republican Party, which was passionately opposed to the extension of slavery into the territories, and it strongly supported this ideology, why it wanted to strengthen the nation, and they saw any prospect of dismembering the nation was completely unthinkable. While in the South, you have the pro-slavery argument. And this is a very different ideology, and it was influenced by different events, such as the Nat Turner Slave Rebellion of 1831, which had terrified many Southern whites of the chances of the slaves actually rebelling and taking over. We also have the expansion of the cotton economy into the Deep South, which made slavery unprecedentedly lucrative. Cotton was king, and that's how you made your money. Also, they feared the growing abolitionist movement. An example of this was the popularity of Harriet Beecher Stowe's novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin. So what happens is you have a new intellectual defense of slavery, and this was the pro-slavery argument in 1837. And you can see it illustrated in the two cartoons that were published in the newspaper that I have here. So what happens with the pro-slavery argument is it actually claimed that slavery was a good. It was a positive good, and that it was good for the slaves because the slaves were treated better in the United States than the industrial workers of the North were. It also said it was a good for Southern society because it was the only way the two races could live together in peace, that the white race had to be dominant over the colored race. Also, it claimed it was a good for the entire country because the Southern economy, which was based on slavery, was the key to the prosperity of the nation. Additionally, it claimed it was a good because it served as the basis for the Southern way of life, a way that was superior to any other in the United States and perhaps even the world. In short, the South was an ideal social order in which all elements of the population were secure and content. And this was based on the belief that African Americans, the slaves, were biologically inferior and inherently unfit to take care of themselves, let alone to exercise the rights of citizenship. And the argument continued that life in the United States as a slave was better than life in your own country, in Africa. And you can see that represented in the two images here. The image on the left, you see the Negro in his own country, where he's sitting outside. He's made to look more barbaric. You can see the wild creatures, and then look over to the right. There's actually a skeleton laying there. And then the next cartoon is the Negro in America. And here you see the slaves sitting on the left, and they're well dressed. They're dressed much like the whites are, that they are inside the house. And so the idea was that the slaves actually had a better life in the United States than they did in their own country. Well, in 1856, James Buchanan, the Democrat from Pennsylvania, is elected president. And this is going to bring us up to the Dred Scott v. Sanford decision. An interesting fact about this decision, when you look at it, it usually says Dred Scott v. Sand, S-A-N-D, Ford. A clerk had actually misspelled John Sanford's name. It was S-A-N-F-O-R-D-S, and the court never corrected it. So what happens in this case is that in March 6, 1857, the Supreme Court actually projected itself into the controversy. Remember, we have these rising tensions between the North and the South. Many consider this case the worst decision the Supreme Court has ever made. It was the first case since Marbury that they actually used their power of judicial review to declare an act of Congress unconstitutional. It did reinforce the Supreme Court's role as the final and binding say on the nation's most pressing issues. However, it also shows how much damage can be done when the court oversteps its own power and authority. Basically, what happens with the decision in this case is it places the stamp of approval on slavery. Historian Michael Trockman claims the decision set fire to the already smoldering blood feud between the North and the South and accelerated the events that led to Lincoln's election and ultimately the Civil War. So what happens in Dred Scott v. Sanford? And this is going to coincide with your readings from the People's History of the Supreme Court. So what happens in the background? First, I want you to look at what Irons tells us to remember. Irons is the author of your book. When we look at the Supreme Court cases, that every case involves a claim of individuals' rights and is brought by a real person who sought legal redress for some kind of oppression. So, let's start with Dred Scott. Who was Dred Scott? Well, Dred Scott was a Missouri slave who was owned by an army surgeon, and the army surgeon would take him with him on his travels. Dred Scott at one point was described as, in 1857, as illiterate but not ignorant, and as a person with a strong common sense. An article in 1858 called him a small, pleasant-looking Negro with an imperial beard, wearing a seedy black suit, and looking somewhat the worse for wear and tear. So what happens with this? Dred Scott's a slave, travels around with Dr. Emerson. Well, why is it important to know where Dr. Emerson and Dred Scott lived? Because there was an established rule. And what happens was twice Emerson had voluntarily taken Dred Scott to live with him into free territory where slavery was illegal. They lived in both Illinois and Wisconsin, where slavery was forbidden by the Missouri Compromise. Then they moved back to Missouri where slavery was lawful. So what happens is there had been a law that said once free, always free. Meaning when Emerson took Scott and his family to free territory, that Scott should have then been free. So what happens is Scott then sues for his freedom. Who suggested to him that he do this? According to Irons, no one really knows, but it had been suggested that maybe a future owner had recommended this. Anyway, what happens, in many prior cases, numerous courts had ruled, and it was the generally accepted law, that once a slave set foot on free soil, he was free. Meaning, when Emerson took him, Scott was not an escaped slave, so the fugitive slave law does not apply. When Emerson took him into the free territory to live, that Scott should have been free. This was even the established legal practice in Missouri. Once free, always free. Slavery then did not reattach when a former slave returned to Missouri. So as soon as Emerson took Scott to either Illinois or Wisconsin, Scott should have been freed. When he came back to Missouri, he still should have been freed and not considered a slave. Well, what happens? In 1846, Dr. Emerson died. Scott, not realizing that this law probably applied to him, tried to buy his own freedom, but Emerson's widow refused. He then sued the widow for his freedom, claiming his residency in a free territory had liberated him from slavery. Well, under the established law, this was easily the case. Once free, always free. As soon as Emerson took him into the free territory, Scott should have been free. So what made this case different? The timing of it. It was first filed suit in 1846, and more than a year passed before the first trial was held in 1847. Then a dispute arose over who actually owned the Scotts. This went on from April 1848 and lasted until 1850. Scott's claim was grounded in Missouri law, and in 1850 the circuit court declared him free following the established practice. However, John Sanford, the brother of Emerson's widow who claimed ownership, He said he and Mrs. Emerson, they both owned it. They appealed to the circuit court's ruling and then this to the state Supreme Court. This case was not decided until 1852. The state court reversed the earlier decision, claiming the ruling was, quote, a humiliating spectacle, that the court would confiscate the property of one of its own citizens by a command of a foreign law. So what is this foreign law that they're talking about? And you can see this is on page 161. The foreign law that they are talking about is the United States Constitution. In fact, Judge Taney, in writing that Missouri was, quote, not bound to carry into effective enactments conceived in a spirit hostile to that which pervades her own laws. So what you have is the judge saying that they are not bound by the Missouri Compromise. So Judge Scott, who was the Missouri judge, claimed of the earlier rulings of once free, always free, said, times are not now as they were when former decisions on this subject were made. And then he went on to praise God for instituting slavery to, quote, raise men like Dred Scott above the level of miserable Africans, end quote. And that's from page 161 and 62 in their book. So what happens is the judge is saying, Judge Scott, not to make things more confusing, right? Judge Scott says that they're not, the ideas that made once free, always free, the law is no longer the case. So then what happens? Dred Scott appeals to the federal court, claiming citizens can sue in federal court, and that he was a citizen because he traveled into free territory under the Missouri Compromise, a federal law, and it should be enforced for his benefit. Sanford's attorney claimed Scott had no standing in federal court because he was not a citizen, because he was a slave. So what happens? Scott loses this case. He applies to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court accepted the appeal. So, what year did the Supreme Court finally rule on this case? 1857. Remember, Scott first filed suit in 1846, so it took over 11 years for this case to finally be decided. Basically, the question at law that the case asked is a freed black a citizen who is entitled to protection under the Constitution or merely property to be bought and sold? So what happens is the case reaches the Supreme Court clerk's office on December 30th of 1854. At this time, there were 5 justices out of the 9 that sided with the pro-slavery South. Oral arguments were heard February of 1856. Well, what happened next? The court couldn't agree, and they did not want to decide the issue before what happened politically. There was a presidential election going on. So what they hoped with the presidential election, that a new president or whoever was elected president would decide the slavery issue. So they waited. So they set re-arguments for December after the electoral votes had been counted. Well, James Buchanan became president, and as the Iron says, he calls him a timid and indecisive man who proved a disaster for the nation. Why? Well, you get all of this information in the book, right? Are you confused by all this going back and forth? And Irons gives you all of this political accountings. Why does he do this? Are you confused by all of it? Probably. And that's why he gives you all this information. The nation itself was in a state of turmoil and over confusion. And so they wanted, even the court itself didn't want to make a decision on the slavery issue and was hoping the new president would. Well, what happens? The Supreme Court wanted the elections to solve the slavery problem, but the candidates running for president completely avoided the issue, and now the Supreme Court was forced to answer the slavery question. James Buchanan again was elected president, and then the court heard a second round of arguments in the Dred Scott case. Now, what's interesting is that President Buchanan actually wanted to point to the court's decision in his inaugural address, but the decision did not come out until March 6, 1857. 2 days after the inauguration. In his address, Buchanan actually said, though, quote, "The question of whether slavery could be lawful in the territories is a judicial question which legitimately belongs to the Supreme Court, before whom it is now pending and will, it is understood, be speedily and finally decided. To their decision, in common sense with all good citizens, I shall cheerfully submit whatever this may be." And he states this, saying that as the new president, right, this is on page 171 in your textbook, that is the new president, that he will abide with whatever the Supreme Court says because that is his role. Do you think Buchanan knew what the court decided? Absolutely. He knew what the outcome was going to be. One of the justices was actually a friend of his, and Buchanan wrote to him to sway him. However, Justice Greer was one of the justices that was holding out, and he did not want the decision to be addressed in the inauguration speech, so he made certain the decision wouldn't be announced until after Buchanan's inauguration. Why? He was afraid of the nation's reaction, and he did not want to be the one on the receiving end of their scorn. Well, what happens is that all 9 justices issues an opinion on the case, making the decision very, very confusing. But ultimately, Chief Justice Taney did speak for the court, and his opinion was considered to represent the judgment of the majority. So what happens if Chief Justice Roger Taney announced the majority decision 7-2 and claimed Scott was not a citizen and that all blacks, all African Americans, had no claims to citizenship? This part of the decision really did not surprise anyone. So what does that mean for Dred Scott? Dred Scott was still a slave. Taney then went on to claim that when the Constitution was written, that blacks held an inferior status and were therefore not even citizens. Taney claimed, on page 173 you can see this, that the framers did not mean to confer national citizenship on any blacks. Then he goes on to describe African Americans, and you can see this on page 173. He says, speaking of the century that preceded the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, he wrote that blacks were, quote, regarded as beings of an inferior order and altogether unfit to associate with the white race either in social or political relations, and so far inferior that they had no rights that the white man was bound to respect, and that the Negro might justly and lawfully be reduced to slavery for his own benefit. That is the quote from Taney's decision. Then he says slaves were property, and under the Fifth Amendment, Congress cannot take a person's property without due process of law. And we see this on page 174. What makes this so awful is that Taney had no legal claims for this, right? He claimed once again they were considered by the framers as property and as not as persons, with all the rights, privileges, and immunities they shared with whites. This argument had no historical basis, but Taney was determined to strip all blacks, free or slave, of their status as persons with constitutional rights. He stated his conclusion with certitude. Not only slaves, but free blacks were, quote, identified in the public mind with the race to which they belong, and regarded as part of the slave population rather than free. This was an audacious and totally false conclusion from dubious historical facts. But how did he get away with this? He completely basically made up the law, saying that this is what the framers intended. How did he get away with it? No one stood up to him. Remember, only 2 justices dissented, and Taney's opinion is considered the controlling opinion of the court. Then the case at this point should have been over. It was an egregious claim that the Supreme Court not only claimed that Dred Scott was still a slave, but then Taney went and tried to strip citizenship from all blacks, free or slave, in the entire country. The case should have been over there. However, Taney takes it even further. Taney was determined to provide a legal basis for extending slavery into all territories. Remember, the Kansas-Nebraska Act had already answered this, but Taney wanted to make the court's stance very clear. So what does he do? Using the power of judicial review, he went on to claim that the Missouri Compromise deprived persons of their slave property, and Congress had no authority to pass this because it was unconstitutional. So this in turn makes the Missouri Compromise null and void, and it made the lands north of the 36th parallel, the line, were no longer free by statute. Basically, this decision nationalized slavery. And he used the example that the government couldn't take a person's livestock without paying him for it, thereby meaning the government couldn't take a person's slave stock property without paying them for it. And so the main question at this point is then, how did Taney do this? How could he get away with this? And you're going to see Irons says on page 176 of your textbook, if this all sounds confusing, which it surely does, much of the blame lies with Taney. He misread history, twisted legal precedent, and bent the Constitution out of shape, all to achieve his predetermined goal of promoting the extension of slavery into the territories. Taney's opinion was a travesty of the judicial craft, ridiculed with obvious errors and outright lies. And so basically what happens because of this decision of Taney's misusing and misconstruing the law and the Constitution to satisfy his own political agenda, basically because of this, it pushes the United States into the Civil War. Many in the North basically saw this as a call to arms, while the South saw it as a validation of states' rights. Now, this case is considered to be a warning to future courts. Dred Scott is cited as the poster child for judicial activism, meaning that the court went far beyond what it needed to do to decide the case. The court never needed to address the federal question. That question was not before them. And if they had simply followed the case law, then Missouri had the final say to say on its own. The Supreme Court, or more accurately, Taney, tried to put itself into the position of resolving the slave question. This was something that was never part of the case, and they should not have done it. It was done because the justices did not speak out against his opinion. Remember, only 2 dissented, but none of them wholly agreed with Taney. And it shows that the Supreme Court, ruled by political motivation and greed, could overstep its own constitutional powers. Many American legal and constitutional scholars consider the Dred Scott decision to be the worst ever rendered by the Supreme Court. However, there was some good that came from the case. What? We get Lincoln. So a year after the Dred Scott decision, Abraham Lincoln, basically unknown on the national stage, challenged Douglas for Douglas's Illinois Senate seat. In the debate, the famed Lincoln-Douglas debates, Lincoln rallied against the injustice of the decision that a slave could live in a free state and yet still be a slave. Lincoln asserted, quote, "A house divided against itself cannot stand. I believe this government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free," unquote. In 1860, the presidential election, Douglas got the Democratic nomination, but he decided not to address the slavery question. His middle ground approach on slavery divided the party. The Southerners left and nominated their own candidate, and so did the Whig Party. Then the Republican Party nominated Lincoln. So you actually have a 4-party election. And what happens is this shattered the Electoral College. Lincoln received a minority of the popular vote, but he won the electoral vote and he was sworn in as president. And guess who he was sworn in by? Chief Justice Taney himself in 1861. Historian Michael Trachman also asserts that an important aspect of the case was that even though Lincoln disagreed with the decision, he did abide by it. Remember, Lincoln was against the Dred Scott decision, but he says, since it was the decision of the Supreme Court, it must be respected until the Supreme Court says otherwise. And in fact, Lincoln said this on the Dred Scott decision. We think its decisions on constitutional questions, when fully settled, should control not only particular cases decided, but the general policy of the country, subject to be disturbed only by amendments of the Constitution as provided in that instrument itself. More than this would be revolution. But we think the Dred Scott decision is erroneous. We know the court that made it has often overruled its own decisions, and we shall do what we can to have it overrule this. We offer no resistance to it. And so what ends up happening is effectively in 1868, after the Civil War, the 14th Amendment effectively overruled the Dred Scott decision, making all persons born in the United States, regardless of color or previous condition of servitude, citizens of the United States. So we can see in here the political ramifications that the Supreme Court can have when it does not follow the Constitution and when it twists the laws for its own political gain. So with all of this, whatever happened to Dred Scott himself? Well, in 1857, the widow remarried the widow Emerson, who was still declared his legal owner. Her new husband was opposed to slavery, so she actually returned Dred Scott to his former owners. The family's name was the Blows. They actually gave Scott and his family their freedom. And then Scott died of tuberculosis the next year. Dred Scott, on his tombstone, reads Dred Scott, born about 1799, died September 17, 1858. Dred Scott, subject of the decision of the Supreme Court of the United States in 1857, which denied citizenship to the Negro, voided the Missouri Compromise Act, became one of the events that resulted in the Civil War. And so that's where we leave off with the Dred Scott decision. That because of this decision, the United States is effectively pushed into the Civil War, and this case was a major, major blow to all colored people within the United States, because Taney not even just said the law of once free, always free is no longer applied, but he took citizenship away from those that had it legally. So what happens is we move into the Civil War. And this is where the two readings I have up for you on Blackboard come into play. First, you have Frederick Douglass's What to the Slave is the 4th of July, and you have Abraham Lincoln's very famous Gettysburg Address. Here's just a little bit of background on both of those. Frederick Douglass was born a slave in Maryland in 1818, and he escaped to New York in 1838. However, he was a fugitive slave. Because of the fugitive slave laws, he could have been captured and taken back. However, he spoke against slavery, and after the Civil War continued to speak out against racism. He's considered as one of the most influential African American leaders of the 19th century. He cherished the Declaration of Independence, and he testified to the nation for failing to live up to these ideals. His goal was to see a multiracial United States which offered equal rights and justice for all. And following the Dred Scott case in 1857, he became much more militant in his writings. Once the Civil War began, he campaigned to make free black men eligible for Union service. He was a strong supporter of the 15th Amendment, which gave black men the right to vote. And he persistently objected every sign of discrimination against blacks and other disenfranchised people, including women. In fact, he even attended the first Women's Rights Convention in Seneca Falls, New York in 1848. He died of a heart attack on February 10, 1895. And what I want you to pay attention to in the writing, What to the Slave is the 4th of July, this was a speech given on July 5th, 1852 in Rochester, New York, and he was asked to speak to these people about freedoms. And I want you to pay attention to is what he talks about this, where he questions, why am I even here? Why are you asking me to speak about freedom when slavery is still going on? And in fact, he calls slavery the great sin and shame of America. So please pay attention to that. And then the second short reading, or the third, I guess, short reading I have you doing is the Gettysburg Address. This is from Abraham Lincoln. His date's 1809 to 1865, 16th president, who was born in Hardin County in Kentucky. Moved to Illinois in 1830, and he was elected president in 1860, as we've already talked about. Well, what happens is Lincoln is president during the Civil War, and he gave the Gettysburg Address after the Battle of Gettysburg was July 1st through 3rd of 1863. This was given 4 months after the battle. Now, the North had won the 3-day battle, but it left over 6,000 individuals dead. And so with this, we'll just talk about some basic facts about the Civil War. The Civil War was the bloodiest war in United States history. Basically, almost as soon as news of Lincoln's election reached the South, leaders were calling for an end of the Union. States began to secede. South Carolina was the first on December 20th, 1860. Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas all eventually left the Union. In February of 1861, they met and formed the Confederate States of America. With the South taking the North's Fort Sumter in South Carolina, the Civil War is seen to officially begin in April 1861. Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina secede within days. The remaining 4 slave states, Maryland, Delaware, Missouri, and Kentucky, remained within the Union. In 1861, Congress passed the Confiscation Act, which declared all slaves used in support of the Confederate military effort would be considered free. In 1862, slavery was abolished in Washington, D.C. and the Western Territories. In July of 1862, a second Confiscation Act declared free the slaves of persons supporting the insurrection and authorized the president to employ African Americans as soldiers. And then on January 1st, 1863, we have Lincoln's famous Emancipation Proclamation. However, this frees all slaves in the Confederacy. Now, if you're in the Confederacy, you are looking that you have seceded from the United States. You do not recognize President Lincoln as your president. So the southern states didn't see that they had to hold themselves to this order. Well, what ends up happening by the end of the war, 2 Union slave states, both Maryland and Missouri, and 3 Confederate states were occupied by Union forces, Tennessee, Arkansas, and Louisiana. By the end of the war, they had all abolished slavery. The war ends in 1865 when General Lee surrenders to Grant on April 9th at the Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia. In 1865, the 13th Amendment abolishes slavery in all parts of the United States. However, that was not passed until December 6, 1865. Lincoln was assassinated April 14, 1865, so he never actually got to see the ratification of the 13th Amendment. This was 4 long years of bloody combat. More than 618,000 Americans died. To put that in perspective, 110,000 Americans died in World War I, and 405,000 died in World War II. There were nearly 2,000 deaths in the Civil War for every 100,000 of population. Compare that to 109 to every 100,000 in World War I and 241 to every 100,000 in World War II. So this was the bloodiest war of United States history. And we can see within this the rising racial cultural tensions that led to this conflict. And with the Dred Scott decision, how this pushed the United States into the war. And what we'll look at in the next section is we are going to look at further about how this decision, and then after the wars, even after slavery is abolished by the 13th Amendment, that all persons born in the United States are given citizenship by the 14th Amendment, and then even the 15th Amendment, which gives African American men the right to vote, how these racial and cultural tensions still continue. And we will look at that with the Supreme Court cases of Plessy versus Ferguson and then Brown versus Board of the Education.